Welcome everyone to our second webinar in our webinar series for the Impact Libraries project, which stands for Improving Assessment of Computational Thinking in Libraries. My name is Megha Subramaniam, and I'm a professor at the College of Information Studies at the University of Maryland. I'm joined today by Dr. David Weintraub. David is an assistant professor at the College of Education and also the College of Information Studies. I'm also joined by a doctoral candidate at the College of Information Studies, Nitsan Koren. Nitsan has been working with us for the past 3 years to build these assessment tools that we are about to unveil to you today. We are delighted to be here with you, and this webinar will be focused on assessment tools that are based on observations, which is computational thinking concepts learning rubric. We'll also share with you design challenge, and we will share with you computational thinking dispositions checklist. We like to remind you that we have one more webinar, our last one, that will be upcoming, and we invite you to either join us or watch the recording if you missed the live webinar. The last webinar will be demonstrating a combination of direct feedback and self-reflection. We'll be sharing 2 tools in that webinar, the Computational Thinking Confidence Survey and the Facilitator Self-Assessment. We also just completed one webinar that focused on directly collecting data from youth, where we highlighted 2 assessment tools, the Build Your Own Interview Protocol and also Talkback Bots. If you missed that webinar, we intend to have the recording available in our website. We want to thank the Institute of Museum and Library Services for generously funding this work. Nitsan will post the link to our website on the chat shortly. So next slide. So we hope to wrap up in about 45 minutes and leave some time for Q&A. You can post the questions that you have in the Q&A panel that you see as we are presenting. So feel free to post the questions as it comes to you, but we will be answering them at the end. What you see on this slide is our presentation outline for today. So if you attended our first webinar, you will see that the presentation outline is quite similar. We start with an overview, and then we introduce the 7 computational thinking outcomes and assessment tools designed in this project. We'll also introduce you to the process of assessment, from identifying an outcome to analyzing data. And then we'll share with you the 3 tools that we're going to unveil today, which is design challenge, the rubric, and the computational thinking dispositions checklist. And also at the end, we will wrap up and there will be time for Q&A. Next slide, please. So just a quick check here. Thank you, Rachel. Rachel just launched this poll. We want to know, are you facilitating computational thinking programs? So are you doing it right now? Or if you're not, maybe planning in the future. So there are 2 options there, yes or no. If you can do that, take maybe like the next 5 seconds to do that. Okay, thank you. So Rachel, maybe, all right. So we have about 75% we're hoping to do it in the future. So it's great that you're here, because I always tell the staff, the library staff that work with me, and also my students, it's always good to think about outcomes before even planning and designing a program. So you are in the right place to have this conversation. Thank you, Rachel. Next slide, please, Dave. So let me just give you an overview of the project before we get to the tools. This will also include stating important definitions that we will use. Next slide, please. So our project has three main goals. The first is to identify computational thinking outcomes. And this is computational thinking outcomes that youth develop through participating in program offered by public libraries. Second goal is to actually develop the assessment tools. So we created assessment tools for library staff to use to accurately measure computational thinking outcomes in their youth programs. And then lastly, we also included this, which is providing guidance for public library staff to utilize our computational thinking assessment tools to improve and refine the programs offered by their libraries. So these are the three main goals of our work. Next slide, please. So you may ask, what is computational thinking? Why should we care about computational thinking? And more so, why should we assess computational thinking programs? So let me tell you a little bit about why we should care about computational thinking program first. So the White House Computer Science for All initiative was launched in 2016 to empower all American students from kindergarten to high school to learn computer science and be equipped with computational thinking skills they need to be creators in this digital economy and not just being consumers. So we would like youth to be active citizens in this technology-driven world. So the concept of computational thinking and its importance to all young people was widely popularized by an article that was written by Janet Wing in 2016. It was a very, very influential article. In that article, she defines computational thinking is a fundamental skill for everyone, not just the computer scientists, going on to say that computational thinking should be added along with reading, writing, and math as an essential skill for all students. So there is very little consensus as into what is the definition of computational thinking program. So if you ask someone what computational thinking program is, you may get different answers from one person to another person. But it's generally agreed upon that computational thinking practices include problem decomposition, developing and using abstraction, debugging, defining algorithms, and concepts grounded in the practice of programming, such as iteration, parallelization, and conditional logic. So then I come to this point, why assessing computational thinking is important. So first, through data collected, you can demonstrate the impact of computational thinking programs to your supervisors, to stakeholders, and funders. Use the data to ask for more resources and support for the continuation of your programs. Also, assessing computational thinking program also allow you to improve the design and delivery of future iterations of the same program. You can use the data that you have collected to even sunset a program or start a new one. If your data says that students are not achieving the intended outcomes of the program, it's probably time to sunset the program and start a new one or revise it based on what the data is telling you. Also, based on the data that you collect, you can also make decisions on how your program can better connect to youth interest in learning. And lastly, and in fact, I view this as one of the most important one, assessing and asking youth to provide feedback gives youth voice to tell you what they want to learn and how. So giving youth voice is why we assess computational thinking program. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that we are also going to define some of the terms that we are going to be using repeatedly throughout this webinar. First is learning outcomes. What are learning outcomes? Next click. So learning outcomes articulate what one should know or can do after completing a course or a program. So learning outcomes are statements of the knowledge, skills, and abilities individuals can demonstrate upon completion of a learning experience or sequence of learning experiences. Next point. Thank you. Learning outcomes should be specific to address one element. Learning outcomes should be simple and well-defined. It should be realistic and aimed at the end goal of an entire program or session and aligned with what is being taught and discussed. So that is learning outcomes. Next slide. So another important definition is assessment tools. So what are assessment tools? Next bullet, please. Assessment tools help facilitators collect and analyze data to measure learning outcomes. And next bullet. Some tools are used to collect numerical or quantitative data, such as surveys. Surveys are tools that generally collect quantitative data. Others are used to collect qualitative data, such as interviews and focus groups. And some assessment tools can be used to collect both qualitative and quantitative data. So those are some of the terms that we would like to define in the beginning of this webinar, which you will see us using throughout this webinar today, as well as when you browse through the tools that we have. Next slide, Dave. So now we are going to introduce you to the 7 computational thinking outcomes that we discovered through our work that is important for library staff to assess in youth computational thinking programs. We will also be sharing 3 of the 7 assessment tools today. Next slide, please. All right, so I always mention this, and you may hear me saying this more than once today. Always choose a tool based on the outcome that you would like to achieve in your computational thinking program that you are or will be offering to your youth. So always think about outcome first and not think about the tools. So we have built tools for you to measure the following outcome. First, click, will be positive experiences. So this is provides youth with positive experience for computational thinking and excites them to pursue future computational thinking experiences. Next, skills. This is to develop computational thinking skills such as problem decomposition, iterative development, and debugging. Next, confidence. This is to see if the program instills a sense of I can do this when they are involved in computational related projects. Next, we have access and equity, which is to see if youth are introduced to new technologies and it evens the playing field for those who might not have access to this technology. Next is dispositions. So we also have tools that measure outcomes related to dispositions, which includes tolerance for ambiguity, persistence, and the ability to work collaboratively with others. And then we have future learning and career. This is to see if our program prepares youth for STEM and computational thinking coursework in school. And lastly, we have conceptual learning, which helps youth to acquire conceptual knowledge associated with computational thinking. So Nitsan will post the link to the outcome selection page on our website. Next slide, Dave. So the impacts libraries assessment tools, right? So we have, like I mentioned earlier, we have 7 tools. So once you have selected the outcome that you want to assess, for your program, you will be given choices on the tools that you would like to use. So the tools that we have, and Dave, you can just simply click all of them. So we have checklist, design challenge, we have rubric, we have survey, we have talkback boards, we have build your own interview protocol, and we also have a self-assessment. So for example, if you would like to assess computational thinking dispositions, you will be given tools that you can choose from, such as the checklist, the talkback boards, and also the build your own interview protocol. So you will see that for each type of outcomes, we have many types of assessment tools that you can use. Next slide. So let me summarize the assessment process for you, and then I'll pass it along to Nitsan. Next slide, please. So what you see on the screen, you're about to see in the screen, is a process that you could undertake. So first, identify an outcome. So you will first identify learning outcomes that you would like to assess. As I mentioned earlier, always start with outcome. And then you will select a tool. Based on the outcomes, you get multiple tools, but you select the tool that you want to use. And then you will prepare to use the assessment tool, which we will show how today, at least for 3 assessment tools. And then you will collect data. So the collection of data can happen before, during, or after the program. And then you will reflect and analyze the responses that you have received, which we also have guides for you to follow. Oftentimes, we see library staff collecting data, but we then don't know what, mostly library staff don't know what to do with it. So our suite of assessment tools come with data analysis sheets, comes with reflection questions, and some tools even have nice visualizations that you can auto-generate. Next slide. So let me just walk you through this one, identify an outcome, which is the first step. So if you've already facilitated a computational thinking program before, reflect on your previous programs and participants. What do you think you achieved? Or what do you want to achieve through this program? If this is your first time, right, then you want to know what youth should gain. And if you are unsure, always consult someone like another colleague or perhaps someone in the community. For the Impact Libraries outcome list, from the Impact Library outcomes list, then you will select the best outcome that describes you want to achieve. So that is the first step, identify an outcome. Next slide. Then you select a tool. So when you select a tool in our assessment suite, you can learn more about a tool. If you play with the website a bit, you'll see that when you see the list of tools that are given to you, there is an eye icon that you can click next to the tool to watch the video and learn more about each assessment tool. You should also consider your program needs, yourself and your participants. Are you comfortable administrating the tool? Think about your plans and the participants and make the right decision. And then you will select the tool, bring all the things that I just mentioned together to make your tool selection. So Nitsan is going to share the 3 tools that we have planned to share with you today.
Thank you, Megha. So the design challenge is the first tool that I'm going to talk about. It's a tool that measures computational thinking skills when youth are working to resolve problem solving in a challenge or design something. Next slide. So what's unique about the design challenge is that it allows you to use existing activities that you already have in your program or to use a set of examples from our tool that we will share soon. It's very easily customizable for your needs. It's short and quick because it only has 5 items that is easy to remember and use over and over again. And it incorporates learning with assessment. So you don't have to have a specific time when you assess. You can just decide when you do it, but you use your activity during the program. Next slide, please. So there are 2 ways to use the design challenge. The first one is to create or use your own program's design challenge, activity, anything that you already plan to do. And you will do that while youth are working to solve a problem. So if you have something like this in your program, you can already use the set of items in the design challenge. If you decide to do that, you need to either create the activity or use an existing one and select the activity when you're going to assign or assess the tool, assess the program, and then create clear instructions for things you want to assess for youth to know what to follow during the activity. Next slide, please. If you don't know what activity you want to use, you can use an existing design challenge from a set of design challenges that we have in the Impact Libraries folder. And it depends on the program that you have. We have 3 different options. One is for unplugged programs, one is for physical computing programs, and the last one is for coding programs. Make sure you select what design challenge will work best for your program based on the skills you're teaching, the tools you're using, the activities that youth are already familiar with, and select the one that is most suitable. And then make the relevant modifications before you start using the examples to make sure these will resonate with youth. Next slide, please. Finally, regardless of what you chose to do, if you create your own activity or use an existing example, you will make sure to review the items on the rubric criteria for the assessment before you start collecting the data. Next slide, please. So once you're done preparing your activity, you will start collecting the data using the design challenge tool. And you can see the tool here on the slide. These are the 5 items that are used and can be used in any activity. You can see they're very general, so they will be useful for any type of activity that uses problem solving. It's best to walk around youth as they work to identify whether they are meeting the criteria. And you can also take mind notes and return to your tablet or computer later to check the boxes. But if you're just starting to use the tool, it's recommended that you take the list with you. You can also print it out for yourself and have enough space for each participant that you have in the program. You will mark each box based on the number of participants and based on the items they are showing. Check out what youth are doing, how they are thinking about their challenges, and look at their final products and ask them questions to make sure they are using the skills. And then see how they explain the different parts of their designs to you if you missed anything. These will be useful during the assessment, but also you can use them to reflect on how you were thinking about what they were doing and what they were answering to your questions. Next slide, please. So the full criteria is scored between 1 to 5. The lowest score one can get is 1. The highest score one can get is 5. In this example here, you can see a facilitator who used the assessment on a group of 10 participants. So she went along and assessed them, and you can see that the first 2 items were the simplest ones for her group, and the last 3 items were the hardest. So only half of the group showed them during the activity. And the follow-up ideas that you can see on the right-hand side are the different things taken from our facilitator guide. that you can actually read through and decide based on the results that you find. So if I take, for example, the second item, youth were able to solve the problem and considered all conditions. She only had 8 participants do it out of 10. So she may want to give more specific instructions to participants who struggled. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about the rubric. The rubric is an assessment tool to measure computational thinking conceptual learning in projects. From small and short projects, you can do whatever you want, to longer, more advanced ones. We will explain the different concepts you can measure shortly as I go through the slides, because the rubric can be a bit complex. Next slide, please. So the rubric is helpful for process measurement because it has various smaller rubrics included in it that you can use to measure small and big projects. It's helpful to process measurement because you can identify different conceptual learning such as planning, troubleshooting, and documentation. This is also why the rubric can be extensive or concise, depending how much you choose to use it. And it has stages, so you can use one rubric and you can use the full one, which is, I think it's 6 different rubrics, and then you'll have a lot of items that you need to assess. And you can break the items down, so you don't have to use all the items at once. You can choose what session to use each rubric. The rubric helps you measure various levels of conceptual learning, and using it, you'll be able to identify how youth advance from basic to more advanced levels of comprehension. One thing we learned from participants through this process is that the rubric actually helps to break down conceptual learning and computational thinking for facilitators. So when they used it, they were able to know better what it means and to assess it better. Next slide, please. So to prepare to use the rubric, first go over the concepts that the rubric measures. It may seem complex, but when you read through the concepts, it's going to be simpler for you to use. And as long as you use it over and over again, you'll get accustomed to it. Based on your planned program, it might only make sense to use a specific rubric. Some of the statements or the entire rubric, it just depends how many sessions you have and what youth are asked to do during the program. You can measure design and planning, prototyping, user testing, modification and revision, testing and debugging, and documentation, or use the whole set of conceptual learning. Then identify the concept that it makes sense for you to assess or you want to focus on based on previous programs. For example, if you know youth are struggling with planning and designing, you will choose to use the rubric and focus on that, or you can use a few. Once you're well familiar with the concept, make plans when to use the rubric and have everything ready at that time. So have the rubric printed out or have a computer with you, a tablet, a mobile phone, so you don't miss the opportunity to measure them when they're working. For instance, you might want to use the rubric when youth are presenting their projects, or when they walk around, or when you walk around them when they're working to test what they're doing. Next slide, please. So there are multiple opportunities for you to collect data, and we want you to think of these opportunities as I explain them now. Next slide, please. And I'm also going to explain the different concepts now. So first of all, you can observe youth interacting with peers. And what's mostly useful in here to measure is user testing. User testing is youth's ability to communicate about a system to potential users. For example, potential players in a game or potential users of that technology. You can observe youth when they interact with their peers or other staff, or test their designs and codes with testers to measure concepts like that, user testing. These interactions will allow you to learn about the specific things that youth will say or do in those instances, and you'll identify the items on the rubric. Next slide, please. So you can also observe youth working individually or with each other to actually plan and design, or modify and revise and test their designs. Plan and design is the ability to plan technologically feasible design, plan a project, and identify steps to take it and realize it. Prototyping refers to the ability to use programming concepts such as variables, conditions, and events, and using modular solutions. You can observe youth when they're working on their designs individually or in groups, and assess most concepts that refer to the actual design process. First, you'll be able to identify how they plan and design and how they are prototyping it, what they're making, what they're sketching or doing. You may want to ask them to walk you through what they're doing. So ask them questions to see what they're saying, and ask them to show you what they're sketching or how they are creating the design. You can also join them and sit with them to see what they're doing. Modification and revision is the ability to assess different approaches or solutions to a problem. Testing and debugging is the ability to consider possible scenarios the user encounter when interacting with the artifact, and test them thoroughly to identify issues or methodically reproduce discovered issues and resolve them. You will also be able to measure these different concepts, especially if you saw what feedback youth received in the user testing part, if you assess that, and you can see if they're implementing that or not. You will also be able to see how they are debugging and testing their designs by following up and sitting closely with them. Next slide, please. And finally, the last thing you can do is observe youth present their projects. This was actually done by one of our participants, and it was really useful for her to understand how youth explain their designs to other youth during the program. So documentation is the ability to clearly and concisely present an artifact, project, game in an appealing manner and describe the steps and processes using CT terminology. And you can observe youth when they present their designs. You'll be able to identify how they documented it, how they explain it to others, what instructions they're giving, how simply they explain it, what is the clarity level. It will also be useful to see the design, which you'll get a chance to if they're presenting, so you can see if they're actually following up on what they said they're doing. Next slide, please. This is an example of the rubric. Specifically, this is the prototyping rubric. In the example that you see on the programming principles, participants scored 3. And the recommendation on the guide is to give them some more guidance that they would be able to mirror others when they're working, once they have a better conceptual understanding. And on the usability and modularity, at the bottom, participants scored 4, which is an advanced level. And the recommendation of the guide is to allow youth more time and opportunity to practice, so they will get to 5. So you can do either of those or repeat and see what happens between the different participants in the group. Next slide, please. So the final tool that I'm going to share today is the Dispositions Checklist. The Dispositions Checklist is an assessment tool that focuses on dispositions of youth in a variety of activities. It is especially useful to assess when working collaboratively, but not only. Next slide, please. So the Dispositions Checklist is useful to measure, as I said, collaborative work, but can also be used to assess individual work. It can be used to assess any activity that youth are doing when engaging with new tools and technology, problem solving, or working in groups to design or code. So you can actually take the different activities you used in the design challenge or what you assessed in the rubric and use the dispositions too. You're just measuring something else. The assessment itself is rarely short and doesn't require much preparation, because it will be useful for any activity you already have in the program. You don't have to create anything in particular. And then you can use the checklist to measure development over time, but you can also check just in one session. That's going to be also useful. Next slide, please. So what dispositions do you want to use? There are 3 different dispositions that you can measure. One is perseverance. The second is tolerance to ambiguity. And the last one is collaboration. And you can assess one of them, 2 of them, or every disposition we have. Make your selection based on the previous knowledge of youth as struggles, things that Mega mentioned before. In the process of preparation for using the assessment tools, you need to think through your participants, think through what you don't know. If you don't know anything, it's okay to assess everything. If you want to test a new activity, it's going to be useful to use the Dispositions Checklist because you would like to see how youth respond to it. If they're working in a new group, or you want to learn, you want to teach them how to work in teams, you will be benefiting from the collaboration Dispositions Checklist. Choose the activity that will be most useful to you for you to observe the youth work. For example, if you measure perseverance, you need to ensure the activity will have some challenge or handling something youth didn't experience before, so how they are going to respond to that. You'll measure how they respond to this challenge or the new experience, or if you want to measure the collaboration, you need to make sure they're working in teams. When you know what activity to measure, review the items on the checklist and ensure that you know what each of them means. So if you see on the screen, these are the items of the perseverance checklist. And if you hover over the items, you'll see different explanations and elaboration for each item for you to learn more if you're not sure. And then finally, you need to get ready to have the checklist ready. As I mentioned to the other tools, you always have to have the list of items with you available. Next slide, please. To assess and collect data with the Dispositions Checklist, you will walk around youth to observe them interact with each other, solving problems or learning about a new device. And then you will see how, if they're persevere, if they are collaborating, if they're tolerant to ambiguity, and how they respond to each of those activities you give them. Check the boxes on the checklist to collect the data of each participant. As you see here, there are 2 participants in the picture, so you will assess each of them individually, and the table will sum up the responses you make automatically. You don't need to do anything but check the boxes. Focus on each participant individually or observe them as a whole group. It depends on what you want to do. Next slide, please. So once you collected all the data, it's going to be useful to open the facilitator guide to see what it means to do each of these, what each of these items mean and how much each participant received means. So most participants in this example had scored 5, except for participant 5, you see they scored 3. This is a real example from a participant who participated in our research. So for this participant who scored 3, the facilitator guide can help reflect on specific questions to ask yourself and identify what was more frustrating to youth. Possible solutions can include offering more one-on-one support from you, or pairing those who struggle with more advanced youth, so they'll be able to balance each other and support each other when working. Next slide, please. So with that, we can wrap up this session, and we're going to have some information about our website and some time for Q&A. Next slide, please. So what the page you see here is the Impact Libraries assessment page that Mega mentioned before. This is when you select the outcomes and see the list of assessment tools relevant for you to use. Next slide, please. If you click the eye icon on each tool, you'll see this video with description and more information. The video will take you through the whole process and will explain how to use the tools, copy the documents, and receive the different information from the facilitator guide and the examples. Next slide, please. We also invite you to read the case studies. The stories of library staff use the assessment tools and filter using the filters on the left-hand side for your outcomes that you're interested in, the served community that you have, the type of program, if you're doing a coding program or an unplugged program, and the mode of delivery, if you're doing an online program or in-person program. These examples will be useful for you to learn how different facilitators use the tools and assess their programs with the different outcomes. Next slide, please.
All right, thank you, Nitzan. As you can see in your screen, we've launched another poll. Which of the assessment tools shared today would you like to use? You can select all that apply. So that's a design challenge, CT conceptual rubric, and dispositions checklist. I'm just going to give you all a few seconds to check off the boxes. All right. Rachel, would you be able to show us the results? Thank you. So it seems like we have a popular tool here, the Dispositions Checklist. But the other two is not too far behind, right? So I think many of you, there's about 11 people who took the survey, who took the poll. So many of you would want to try the design challenge and the CT conceptual rubric as well. Nitzan mentioned earlier about all the examples that we have. I would really encourage you to look at the examples, specifically the examples of how library staff have used these tools to measure the outcomes that they desired. So thank you so much for that, Rachel. You can close the poll. Next slide. All right, so with that, we would like to thank a couple of people that have helped us throughout this project. First, to the library staff who participated in the different phases of our study. I think we have about 90 library staff nationwide that helped us through various phases of our study. So thank you to all of them. To our advisory board members are listed on our website. You can take a look. They have been really influential in terms of being the sounding board for this project and have been helping us throughout this 3 years. Again, to Institute of Museum and Library Services for generously funding our work. Thank you, IMLS. And to all of you who are today attending our webinars and those who will be watching our webinars later. If you have any questions or anything, you're welcome to email us at impact@umd.edu. So that's impact@umd.edu. You're also welcome to browse through our website, play with the tools, make copies of the tools and use them. So with that, thank you so much for attending.